Christopher Nolan doesn't own a mobile phone. He doesn't even have an email account. His office is only a 2-minute walk away from his house in LA, so he doesn't spend a lot of time outdoors. His media interaction is limited to only when he has a movie coming out. And if any interviewer asks him a question that can betray his emotions, that can tell us a little about who he is really, he chooses not to answer. Chris Nolan is as close to a reclusive artist as anyone can be in modern times. There's no memoir or autobiography or essays that can help us understand who he really is. There is one official book called The Nolan Variations by Tom Schoen, which we'll reference quite a lot in this episode. But the book also doesn't really answer the question, who is Chris Nolan? I mean, who is he really? So, as I was researching this episode, I was in a fix. Because how do I tell the story? How do I get to know who the real Chris Nolan is? What should be my source material? Because there is no definitive source material. And then it occurred to me that of course there is. It's hidden in plain sight. Michael Caine's voice from The Prestige boomed in my mind. Are you looking closely? There is a lot of source material. In fact, there's 12 of them, each one of his movies. One thing that you should know about Chris Nolan right at the top is that this man has not thought about anything else in 55 years of his life other than films, other than cinema, other than the craft of filmmaking. He is his films. Even if he writes a book about himself in plain English text, it won't even remotely come close to telling us who he is than his films do. So that's what we are going to do. We are going to peel the onion that Christopher Nolan is through his films. And you can only peel the onion starting outwards till you reach the absolute center. So we will start the story outwards from what Christopher Nolan is today, the most celebrated, the most bankable, the most successful filmmaker of our generation. And then we will go inwards to find out who he was without the fame, without the success, without the glory, the rawest form of Chris Nolan. And the only way to do that is to tell the story backwards in quintessential Chris Nolan style. And you'll see that this story only makes sense when we tell it backwards. We'll tell the story using 3 films from his filmography, 3 key moments from his life when he took incredible creative risks, starting with Oppenheimer, then the Dark Knight trilogy, and finally ending at the beginning with Memento. This is All Risk is Creative. I'm your host Palash Kulkarni, and you are listening to Christopher Nolan Creates Amaze. We begin in October of 2020. The COVID pandemic has been going on for over 6 months, and Christopher Nolan has been fighting all this while with the executives over at Warner Brothers, his longtime studio, to somehow release his film Tenet as wide as they possibly can, given the entire world is under lockdown. But despite their efforts, the film fails at the box office. It does about $365 million on a $200 million budget, which in movie parlance is a box office flop. Because a film needs to earn at least twice the amount of its total budget, as 50% of the box office collections are retained by the theaters. It becomes the first flop of Christopher Nolan's career. You can say that it wasn't his fault, he was just unlucky with the COVID pandemic, but it is what it is. But what this does is it puts a strain on the relationship between Christopher Nolan and Warner Brothers, the studio that had produced and distributed the last 9 of Nolan's films, a relationship that goes back 2 decades. And then in 2021, Warner Brothers does what could be called their costliest mistake. They announce that all their films will release on the same day on HBO Max as in theaters. And they announced this without consulting their directors, including Nolan, who is their ace director. And it pisses Nolan off so much because the theatrical experience is very, very important for Nolan. He shoots his films with these heavy, bulky IMAX film cameras, which is very inconvenient, by the way. I mean, if you want to shoot with these cameras, you not only need to be the best cinematographer out there, but also be like a bodybuilder or something. These things are so heavy, and Nolan goes through all that trouble and puts his cinematographer through all that trouble so his audience can get the best theatrical experience possible on planet Earth. And Warner Brothers has just defecated on all of that. So Nolan is so pissed that he breaks his 20-year relationship with Warner Brothers and walks out. So, on top of Tenet being a complete damn squib, his 2 decade long relationship with Warner Brothers has broken. And on top of that, culturally speaking, the audience doesn't want to go to theaters anymore, especially to watch original films, the kind of films Nolan makes. Only films with superheroes or franchise films or animated films are doing well. In 2021, if you looked at the top 10 films of the previous 5 years, all of them were either superhero films or franchise films or animated films made for kids. All the other films, original films, so to speak, which are not sequels or part of a franchise, were largely dependent on streaming services. And Nolan doesn't like this turn of the culture one bit. He absolutely hates the fact that the theatrical experience is dying. And he also disagrees with this belief that audiences won't come to theaters to watch original films, that they will come to watch only these grand action spectacles. So, all of this is happening as Nolan is thinking about what film to make next. One day, his producer friend, Charles Rowan, hands him a book called American Prometheus: The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. Nolan reads the book and absolutely loves it. So much so that he thinks and decides that Oppenheimer will be his next film. So he starts shopping the idea around with the top studios in Hollywood after saying F off to Warner Brothers. And he finally zeroes on to Universal Studios, especially because he likes and respects the head of Universal Studios, Donna Langley. Now, this is a good time to quickly explain the business model of Hollywood studios and why Universal agreeing to produce Oppenheimer with Nolan at this point in time was a completely contrarian bet. Essentially, the Hollywood studios, are in the business of allocating risk capital. Studios read hundreds of scripts and movie ideas, and based on their understanding of what the audience wants to watch, they allocate capital by selecting the right movie ideas, the right movie scripts. Now, there are two ways to go about this. The first one is obvious. You figure out what's working, what has been working, and just do more of that. That's the basis of 95% of the films you see today. Disney decides to make that 31st Marvel film because they know that the audience loves Iron Man, they love Thor, they love Captain America, and all those superheroes. And there's a very high likelihood that they will want to watch another film featuring those characters. So it's a safe, intelligent risk to take. And then there is the second kind of risk, which is much bigger, but also the reward is much bigger. If you look closely and think about some of the best times you yourself have had at theaters, you will notice a pattern, which is that when you go to watch a movie in theaters and the movie turns out to be different than what you were expecting in a good way, that movie somehow affects you a lot more. That movie somehow evokes a deeper emotion in you. And it's also likelier that you will recommend that film to your friends stronger than you would recommend any other film that just barely met your expectations. That movie also has a greater impact on the culture as a whole. Because although the movie went against your expectations, against what you are used to see, it actually delighted you. So the second mode of risk actually creates something new as opposed to the first mode that just iterates on what is previously known. But there's a problem with the second mode with respect to the Hollywood studios, which is that the studios need to do something fundamentally different than what the people are expecting, what people are used to. But how do you do that? Because the data tells you what's working. It doesn't tell you what can work. So that's the creative part in risk taking, to do something that the data doesn't tell you and still succeed. And this success can be disproportionate and non-linear because it sort of creates a new category of films. Another simple way to see this dichotomy in action is with Netflix, which arguably has the best in class data about what people like to watch, what genre, what kind of films, what kind of shows, all of that. But even with that data, Netflix struggles very often with the quality of the stuff they produce. If data is all it takes to create incredible shows and films, Netflix should have been the undisputed winner and the best quality creator in the world. And we all know that Netflix is not. Clearly, there's more to it than data. That is because fundamentally, the audience wants to watch something new, something exciting, something different, but they do not know what they want. It is the job of the filmmakers and the movie studios to take that risk and surprise and elevate people. So, coming back to Universal Studios and to Chris Nolan, to make Oppenheimer in 2021 was a contrarian bet, a risk of the second category that we just discussed, because the film went against the data of the time. Number one, it wasn't a superhero film, it wasn't a franchise film. That's what seems to be working during the COVID pandemic. It's none of that. Okay, but does it have action? Does it have that kinetic thrill to it? Does it have grand action spectacles? No, it does not. Half of it is about making of the atomic bomb, not even dropping of the atomic bomb, and the other half is a boring black and white Senate hearing. So, why is Universal agreeing to spend $200 million on this film? What does Nolan see in the film that he is so confident that people will love it despite it not checking all the right boxes? Well, Nolan believes that it is not about the grandness of the spectacle as much as it is about the grandness of the idea underneath. The grandness can exist in your mind, not necessarily on the screen itself. Audience is not dumb. In fact, audience is very smart. That's been the basis of Nolan's career. You can give the audience emotional stimulation if you show them something powerful. Take their minds on a journey through a grand idea. And Nolan believes that the Oppenheimer story is that grand idea. Because when Nolan reads the book, he is drawn to something specific in the story. It is actually one specific scene from the book, and he believes that he can construct an entire film around this one scene. And the scene is the Trinity test, the testing of the atomic bomb. Especially the fact that when they were doing the Trinity test, there was a small chance that they would blow up the entire world. And they still did the test because for them, that's how important making the atomic bomb was. But this is just one scene. There's something more fundamental, something more existential to the Oppenheimer story that appealed to Nolan. After reading the book, Nolan believed, and he pitches this to Universal, this idea to Universal, that Oppenheimer is the most important person in human history. Whether we like it or not, we live in Oppenheimer's world. Because Oppenheimer is not only known for inventing the atomic bomb, but also regretting his own creation, regretting his own invention. And the reason he regrets it is because of his creation, humanity had finally become capable of completely ending itself. Never before in 100,000 years of human history had that been possible. Even if anyone wanted, even if humanity wanted, it did not possess the technological means to do it. In fact, let me put it even more radically. Between now and eternity, there is a zero chance that an atomic bomb will not be used. All it needs is one irrational decision in a world full of irrational people. And when it will be used, humanity will see destruction like never before of apocalyptic proportions. And so, yes, Oppenheimer is one of the most important people in history. That's the grandness of the film. The grandness is in its scope. And if you've seen how the film ends, it ends at that unsettling moment when you are left pondering over this question, the central existential question of whether the natural arc of scientific advancement will actually lead us into a good place. And the film doesn't give you any easy answers. It actually shows you two different perspectives. It shows you the perspective of Oppenheimer, which is a very subjective experience from Oppenheimer's point of view. And then it shows you this objective view of what did the people around him think, especially Louis Strauss. That's the powerful idea at the heart of it. And of course, this powerful idea is dressed in impeccable filmmaking, IMAX cinematography, that delicious background score, and of course, incredible performances by Cillian Murphy, by Robert Downey Jr., Matt Damon, Emily Blunt, and all those amazing actors. So, yeah, the film is grand, but not because there are 10 superheroes fighting in every scene with each other. It's grand because your mind makes it grand. And Nolan thinks that's what matters. That's what makes a film great and exciting and emotionally and intellectually stimulating. So Nolan takes the risk, and Universal makes this contrarian bet. They make the film, and the film releases in July of 2023. And the film not only does well, not only does the $500 million it needs to break even, but does double that amount, almost $1 billion at the global box office. And this is well beyond Nolan's expectations, Universal's expectations, and the expectations of all those cultural commentators who believe that original films are dead. It becomes the third highest grossing film of that year and the highest grossing original film that's not based on an IP or a franchise that year, and still actually is almost 2 years after the film was released. It goes on to win 7 Academy Awards, including Christopher Nolan's first Oscar for Best Directing, an award that had eluded him all his life. And most importantly, pretty much changes the conversation around franchise films versus original films. Now, commentators and people in Hollywood at least begin to entertain the idea that you don't need superheroes and franchise to be successful at the box office. You need grand ideas that are made well. The culture won't change overnight, but at least someone has shown the way. At least now we know that it's possible. At least now we know that an original film, if it's made well, can do $1 billion. And after Oppenheimer, in the very next year comes Dune 2, which also does fantastically well. Yes, I know it's a sequel, but I think for all intents and purposes, it can be considered an original film. That also does, I think, upwards of $700 million. So the culture begins to change. The culture at least begins to believe that original films have a place, have a legitimate place in this world that is just oversaturated with superhero films. And so Nolan succeeds in fighting this oversaturation of superhero films. But how did we get here? How did this culture of superhero films begin? How did our culture become so saturated with superhero films that it became exhausting? Well, it actually started with the incredible commercial and critical success of one film called The Dark Knight, directed by none other than Christopher Nolan himself. And so, weirdly and ironically, just like Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan was fighting the monster he himself had created. As Niels Bohr says in the film, you can't lift the stone without being ready for the snake that's revealed. And so, to understand how we reached this point, we have to go back to the year 2003, right before Christopher Nolan started making the Dark Knight trilogy. Let's peel another layer of our Christopher Nolan onion to go to a time when Chris Nolan was a virtual nobody. I actually went to the Internet Wayback Machine and checked the Wikipedia page of Christopher Nolan way back from 2003, 2004, that time period. And the Wikipedia page has just one line which says Christopher Nolan, born July 30, 1970, is a British film director, writer, and producer. And then there is one small filmography section which has 3 films: Following, Memento, and Insomnia. So in 2003, no one really knew who Christopher Nolan was. He had just finished making the film Insomnia, which was his first big studio film with Warner Brothers. But it was not a Christopher Nolan film as we know a Chris Nolan film today. Insomnia was a work for hire film, meaning he did not write the screenplay. Someone else wrote the screenplay. It was actually a remake of a Norwegian film, and Nolan was just hired as a director by Warner Brothers to direct the film. The film does well, not extraordinarily well, and that's the end of it. It's not like he has another job from Warner Brothers waiting for him to make another film. So, as his next project, he starts writing a biopic on Howard Hughes, not with Warner Brothers, but with someone else. Howard Hughes, as you know, was this great American entrepreneur, filmmaker, movie producer, aviator. Pretty interesting story. It's a story of a guy who's orphaned when he's very young and then goes on to build these mammoth undertakings. And as Nolan is deep into writing the script, it turns out that another filmmaker is making a film on Howard Hughes, none other than Martin Scorsese. And that too with Leonardo DiCaprio playing Howard Hughes. And Nolan realizes that he will have to abandon his script because there's no way anyone in Hollywood is going to entertain him, a virtual nobody, when Martin Scorsese, the great Martin Scorsese himself, is making a film on the same subject. So now he's back to square one, looking for new work out in the market with his agent. Then one day, he learns that Warner Brothers is thinking of rebooting their Batman franchise. Rebooting because about 6 years earlier, following the disastrous reception of the Batman and Robin film starring George Clooney as the Batman, Warner Brothers had killed that franchise. But now they want to reboot it and they are looking for new ideas. But there's not a lot of interest among established filmmakers to take this job because just the PTSD of the commercial and critical failure of the previous Batman film is still so fresh in people's memory that everyone wants to stay at an arm's distance from Batman. In fact, that Batman and Robin film ended up destroying the career of its filmmaker Joel Schumacher. So it's natural to understand why people are a little scared of taking up this project. Just imagine the change. I mean, today no one will believe that filmmakers did not want to direct a superhero film in 2003. That to a Batman film. That's the beauty of culture. It can change a lot in 10 years. All it takes is one guy. Anyway, our guy, freshly out of a job, sees an opening here. He had liked the Batman comics from his childhood, but it wasn't like he was a fanatic of Batman or anything. My reading of the whole situation is that he really wanted a big job, and because no one was dying to direct the next Batman film, he made a go for it. He took the risk. And again, much like when he was making Oppenheimer, he had a contrarian idea, simple idea for making the Batman film. The contrarian idea was that superheroes are also human beings. They also inhabit the same world as we do. They are also influenced by the same cultural forces that we are. And this is not a new idea, to be very honest. In fact, superheroes were created in response to real cultural forces. Superman was created during the Great Depression, for example, symbolizing hope during times of adversity. Batman was created almost as a counterpoint to Superman by DC Comics, also in the 1930s. Captain America was created during World War II as the American superhero soldier who fights the Nazis. But over time, these characters that were born out of real cultural forces became caricatures as the underlying cultural context completely changed. And Nolan's grand idea was that Batman should be tied back to the culture, that the new Batman films should be rooted in the reality of our times, which means that it's not Batman that's the center of the story, but actually Bruce Wayne. Batman is just a manifestation of Bruce Wayne. So, if you really want to humanize Batman, you have to begin with Bruce Wayne and tell the story of why he chose to become Batman in response to real cultural forces. So, he takes this idea to Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers are not thrilled about it, but it's okay because it's not a hot job, they entertain it and ask Nolan to develop the idea further. And Nolan gets to work with the simple idea that let's humanize Batman. Let's see how Bruce Wayne becomes Batman. Now, in the original comics, the origin story is literally one page long, which is that as a child, Bruce Wayne sees the murder of his parents by a criminal, and that inspires him to fight the crime in the city. That's all. But Nolan realizes that this is not enough. This is too superficial if Batman has to be humanized. Orphaning at a young age does not explain everything about the adult that the child becomes. And he knows this because that's the story he was just writing of Howard Hughes. Just like Bruce Wayne, Howard Hughes is also orphaned as a child and then as an adult becomes this super ambitious, successful business mogul. And as he was reading the literature around Howard Hughes, he realized that most stories focus on this orphan thing a lot. But that's not enough to explain Howard Hughes. And he takes that idea to Batman and begins developing it. And so, like it usually happens, no creative idea goes to waste. If Nolan had not written that Howard Hughes script, who knows, the Batman trilogy wouldn't have turned out the way it is, and by extension, our culture would probably be a little different. So, anyway, Nolan believes that there needs to be more in the origin story, and that's what he writes. In Batman Begins, if you've seen the film, the entire first hour is just Bruce Wayne slumming it out, getting beaten by the League of Shadows, trying to conquer his own fears to become Batman. He starts as this bratty billionaire who wants nothing but to kill his parents' murderers, goes into the wilderness to understand the mind of criminals in order to overcome his own fear, and comes of age from there. And after half the film has already taken place, becomes Batman. That is the humanization that Nolan wanted and it works fantastically. Batman Begins is loved by the critics. On a budget of, I think, $150 million, it brings in about $375 million. So Warner Brothers turns in a decent profit, and our man, Chris Nolan, finally gets his foot in the door of Hollywood. He has delivered a successful film. He has gained the respect of the studio. He has earned some confidence about the quality of his own ideas. And so now he can become a little bit more himself in this crazy world of Hollywood. And this is a very important stage in Nolan's life because most filmmakers make a mistake here. What happens is that when a filmmaker in Hollywood suddenly becomes too hot, he is flooded by film offers and big film offers. That is to say, that if Batman Begins was a $150 million film, they will be offered a $200 million film. And the filmmaker is obviously tempted to take it because their direction fee as a percent of the total budget also shoots through the roof. That's why Greta Gerwig, after making amazing films like Lady Bird and Little Women, is now making Barbie and Narnia. That's why Barry Jenkins, after making the very original Moonlight, recently made the new Lion King film. But when you accept a studio film as a director for hire, you tend to lose your originality. You tend to lose your original ideas. And this happens all the time. So Nolan also did have that choice, but he does the exact opposite. He doesn't do a $200 million film, a $150 million film, or even a $100 million film. He does a relatively small film called The Prestige that costs only $40 million to make because what Nolan really wants in the heart of his hearts, what he deeply, deeply cares about, is his own original ideas. He wants to see the ideas in his head come to life, become films, impact the culture. And this is a very risky move, by the way, because after Prestige, when Nolan will go out to look for his next film, his paycheck will be decided based on the last film he did. And especially if the film does not do well, and the chances of that are high because Nolan is not delusional enough to believe that Batman did well only because of him. He knows that it did well because A, it was a Batman film, because it had Christian Bale, because it had Liam Neeson, because it had all those action scenes. Yes, it was his idea that definitely contributed to it. But that's not to say that the entire world is waiting with bated breath for his next film. So, doing this $40 million film that has no backing of a franchise is a very risky career move. But he still does it because he wants his original ideas to become films. And like every ambitious creative person, his deepest desire is to see if what he's from inside, his original ideas, his self image, the thing that he cares about, does that have a place in the world? And so he makes The Prestige with Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman, writing his own screenplay, making it the way he wants. And if you've seen The Prestige, it's a deeply original film. This is Nolan trying to become himself. High risk, high reward, no pain, no gain. But pain he does feel. When The Prestige is about to release, the film tracks very poorly. Tracking is basically studios have this system to predict how much the film is going to open, how much it is going to bring in the opening weekend before the film actually releases. And The Prestige, before its release in October of 2006, was tracking very poorly. The early reviews were terrible. It was expected to open third or fourth at the box office. And while Nolan doesn't say this, but it's obvious that he was deeply heartbroken because he took a bet on himself, wanting to prove to himself and the world that his original ideas have a place in the world. Turns out that's not true. He failed. Must have been pretty heartbreaking, obviously. Anyway, the film releases, and to Nolan's and everyone's surprise, after the film releases, everyone loves the film. And in another week, the word on the street completely flips, and The Prestige becomes the number one film at the box office and goes on to collect over $110 million on a budget of $40 million and becomes a bona fide super hit. As Nietzsche says, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Now no one can stop Christopher Nolan from becoming himself. Now no one can stop him from exerting his mind and his brain onto the world. He has crossed that river of self doubt. Now he is just going to double down on his instinct and his creativity. This is where Christopher Nolan begins to become the Christopher Nolan that we know today. And then, with that level of self confidence on him and his ideas, he starts working on the film that will not only change his life, his career, but cinema and culture itself. He starts working on The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight is the film where he completely becomes himself. This is where he owns the entire creative stack. This is where he starts shooting with the IMAX film camera, something that has now become synonymous with him. This is also where his relationship with Hans Zimmer really blossoms. This is where he starts using his quintessential editing technique of intercutting between different plots and different timelines and tying them together to move the narrative forward. This is where he extracts some of the best performances of all time from his actors. I mean, Heath Ledger as the Joker is an all time acting performance. And this is where his principal idea for the entire Batman trilogy, which is to humanize Batman, really comes out. And, I watched The Dark Knight again for this episode, and I must have already watched that film a dozen times. It is my personal favorite of Christopher Nolan, and I do believe that it is his best film to date, period. Watching that film again was just incredible. I mean, so many things about the film, the economy of storytelling, every line, every shot, every cut moves the story forward. It is 2.5 hours long and the film just vanishes. I mean, I have goosebumps talking about it right now because that film is just so brilliantly conceived and so well executed that everyone who's watched that film and truly understood that film, it's impossible that you'll ever forget the feeling when you watched it for the first time. And of course, that film prints money when it releases. It becomes the highest grossing film of that year and becomes Nolan's first film to cross $1 billion at the box office. And most importantly, it ushers in an era of superhero films for the next decade and a half. And it sort of lays the prototype of what superhero films are gonna look and feel like for the next 15 years. If you just go to the Wikipedia article of The Dark Knight and go to the legacy section, then click on all the citations, there are like a dozen articles on how every superhero film that came after The Dark Knight basically tried to copy something or the other from the film. The realism, the idea of rooting the film in the politics of modern times, the idea of this ambivalent villain, the Joker, who actually has a legitimate point of view, but it is just opposed to the value system of the superhero. So many of these tropes are a direct import from The Dark Knight. Hollywood goes from not wanting to make superhero films to literally wanting to make only superhero films until it becomes just so exhausting and tiring that Nolan himself has to fight it with Oppenheimer. Isn't that amazing? This is a good time to introduce another idea about Christopher Nolan, something that is said a lot about him. And I think it is Tom Schoen's phrasing, which is that Nolan is a minimalist with maximalist production values. We have been saying the same thing in different words in this episode, which is that what he looks for in each film is a simple idea. That's the minimalism part. But expresses that idea with as much maximalism and complexity as possible. His films are like mazes in which you find yourself completely lost sometimes. But at the center of the maze is a very simple idea. So after you have watched the film, you may not quite remember how you got through the maze, the turns you took, the detours you took, just like it happens in an actual maze. But long after you have seen the film, you will remember the idea that the maze was hiding, just like you remember the moment you finally solve an actual maze. And it's not like the maze is there for the sake of it, that the complexity is there for the sake of it. There is a functional reason. The maze solves a purpose, which is that you cannot watch a Christopher Nolan film without being absolutely present and mindful. You have to be there with your mind and with your heart. That's why he likes theaters where you can just forget the outside world and be present in the movie. Because the payoff in the end is proportional to the amount of emotional and intellectual investment you put in. That's why, after you have watched a Nolan film, you get this feeling of achievement, this feeling of an amazing payoff. And because you feel that way, his films remain with you long after you have seen them. That's the purpose of the maze. It is a much needed emotional and intellectual workout for your mind. And that's why I think Nolan continues to be relevant today in this age of quick gratification where you are served emotions and ideas very quickly in under 30 seconds. But those ideas and emotions are cheap. They don't stick because you didn't work hard to get them. Having them is as good as not having them. But not with Nolan. His mazes are built to make you feel that you have earned every bit of intellectual and emotional stimulation. And when you truly earn something, it stays with you. And he is obsessed with this idea, by the way, this idea of the maze. So much so that the logo of his production company, Syncope, is a maze. Check it out. That's why Nolan wanted to become a studio filmmaker. That's why he wanted to have big budgets to make his films, so he could create the most stunning metaphorical mazes to represent his simple ideas. But that wasn't always the case. The studios came much after. He did not start big. He started as a guy with ideas, that's all. So, what did he do then? How did he create a maze without the money, without the budget, without the studios? Let's now peel the last layer of the Christopher Nolan onion and go straight to its center to find out who Christopher was before he became Christopher Nolan. The year is 1997, and Chris Nolan is 27 years old. He is on a road trip with his brother Jonathan from Chicago to Los Angeles. Jonathan, as you might know, would later become Christopher's frequent collaborator and would himself go on to create shows like The Westworld and Person of Interest. On this road trip, Jonathan, or Jonah as he's fondly called, tells Chris a story idea about a guy who cannot form new memories, a condition colloquially called short term memory loss. And what would happen if this person's wife, this protagonist, his wife was killed, and this protagonist is trying to find and kill his wife's killers, but he doesn't remember what he did 10 minutes back. And Nolan, Chris Nolan, instantly loves the idea. He starts writing the screenplay right away. But he knows that there is something more to this idea, something that he's not seeing yet. What has attracted him so far is a mere plot point, like the Trinity test scene attracted him to Oppenheimer. But he still hasn't gotten that simple, grand existential idea that he always looks for. But he knows that it's in there somewhere. He just needs to figure it out. And the only way to figure it out is to put himself in the shoes of this guy who cannot create new memories. But as he's writing the screenplay, he realizes that it's not only him that needs to understand the peculiar predicament of this guy, but also the audience. And the narrative trick he comes up with to make the audience feel what this guy is actually feeling is to tell the story backwards, starting with the end and ending at the beginning. Because just like the protagonist does not know what happened 15 minutes back, the audience, when they are watching the film backwards, will not know what happened just before the scene that they are watching. And remember, all of this is in service to that one simple existential idea that he's looking for in the film. And finally, with this exercise, when he finishes writing the script, he gets it. Now, I'm going to give you the plot of the film, so spoiler alert. If you've seen the film, as I said, it's about this guy whose wife has been murdered and he's trying to find and kill the murderers. And because the story is told backwards, the film actually begins with the protagonist killing the murderer. And then it goes back, scene by scene, to the very beginning, to how it all started. But as you are watching the film, you think, well, what's the fun here? Because I already know the end, so why watch this film? But then, when you reach the end, you realize that, hold on, if I cannot remember what I did 10 minutes back, there are two fundamental things that will happen. Number one, if I have to continue living, I need to have some grand purpose in my life or I will just be completely lost. And the film actually shows this other guy who also has the same short term memory loss disorder but has no purpose and he has a terrible time just living his life. Good that our protagonist does have a purpose, which is to find his wife's killers and kill them. So that's good. But hold on. What happens when the purpose is met? What happens when this guy has found his wife's killers and killed them, like he does in the beginning of the film? Well, there goes his life, because without purpose, his life is nothing. So, as we reach the end of the film, which is the beginning of the story, we see to our complete shock that the protagonist had already found and killed his wife's murderers. But he knows that if he does not have a purpose, he will not be able to live. So he sets himself another puzzle, gives himself another purpose, and good for him that he does not remember that he's just killed his wife's murderer, so he can just do this forever. Because that's the only way he can survive. This is like the myth of Sisyphus reimagined. This is the grand simple idea that Nolan was looking for, which is that a person with short term memory loss will basically have no conscience at all because he doesn't remember. Conscience is possible only when you have memory. Morality necessitates that you remember. And the only way you, the audience, can figure this all out, can feel this existential idea deep in your bones, is if you put yourself through the maze that Nolan has created and travel through it the way he wants. And mind you, Memento was made when Nolan was a nobody. It was made without a studio. It was made for just $4 to $5 million, which is very low budget. In fact, the whole movie feels so low production that most of it literally happens inside a motel room. And yet, Nolan creates a maze which is so powerful that when you solve the maze, you are left questioning the very nature of conscience, purpose, and memory. This is Nolan without the power, without the big studio, without the big cash, without anyone in the world knowing who Chris Nolan is. And what you find is he is exactly the same as the Chris Nolan of Oppenheimer, as the Chris Nolan who's the most successful filmmaker of our generation. It doesn't matter that he doesn't have the money, the studio, all of that. He will still look for big ideas, surround it with the most stunning maze, and when you, the audience, go through that maze, you will come out marveling at this world and your own life a little more. The money, the power, the studio later in his life just help him amplify it. But I can tell you with full confidence, having studied Chris Nolan's life and works closely for over a month now, that if you take all of it away from him, even today, he will still be making stunning, awe inspiring films. And if you want proof, just go and watch Memento. When you read the story of his childhood, it seems like this man was born only to make films. When he was 7 years old in 1978, his father took him to a screening of 2001 A Space Odyssey, knowing very well that he wouldn't understand it. I mean, this is a film which even fully grown adults don't understand, let alone a 7-year old kid. But Chris remembers the screening like it was yesterday. He didn't understand much, but something moved inside him. Something inside him changed. He had seen movies before, but never something like this. He would later say, and I'm taking this from Tom Schoen's book, that it was that day at 7 years old he learned that movies could be anything, and that you don't have to necessarily always understand a movie, you have to feel it. Don't try to understand it, feel it. 5 years later, he went to a boarding school. He was 12 years old. In the boarding school, the kids were sometimes allowed to watch films with the housemaster. One day, Chris watches the film Blade Runner. A few days later, he watches the film Alien. Both are very different films. But Chris, 12-year-old Chris, senses something similar in them. There's something that unites both films. And then he learns that both the films are directed by the same man, Ridley Scott. And it's in that moment he realizes that's what he wants to become. He wants to grow up and become a film director. 2 years later, he's 14 and he is already in love with films. That's all he thinks about all day. At night, after lights out, when no one is watching, he smuggles batteries inside his dorm room and warms them on a radiator so they can last as long as they possibly can. Because when everyone's asleep, he lies in his bed, puts those batteries in his Sony Walkman, and listens to soundtracks of films on repeat, and imagines the scenes from those films, everything coming alive in front of his eyes, the music taking him to 1,000 different worlds. That is his dream, that one day, maybe one day, he will get the opportunity to actually make his own film and bring those amazing worlds in his head to life. 40 years later, in his 12th film, he writes a scene about a troubled physicist, also lying in his bed in his dorm room alone at night, imagining different worlds, the hidden worlds of quantum physics. Just like 40 years back, Chris Nolan himself had lied in his dorm room, imagining new worlds of cinema. And by total accident, or maybe not, you never know with Chris Nolan, that scene with the physicist would be scored on a soundtrack called Can You Hear the Music? That film would go on to win Christopher Nolan his first Academy Award and would prove to the world that great movies will never die if all of us, love them as much as Christopher Nolan does. That's all on this episode of All Risk is Creative. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to All Risk is Creative. This podcast is owned and produced by Cosm Entertainment Private Limited. Original music composed by Mehul Fadnavis. Sound mixing and mastering by Ankit Thakur. And I'm your host, Palash Kulkarni. You can find me on X at A Bigger Splash. That's ABIGGERSPALASH. If you have any feedback on the podcast, you can DM me on X or write to me at palash@cosm.in. That's COZM.in.